Our first reading is taken from Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 to 11. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. As the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return to it without watering the earth and making it bud and flourish, so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. The second reading is taken from Mark chapter 1, verses 21 to 34. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then, a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." The evil spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching, and with authority he even gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him." News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. This is the word of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Thanks so much, Lomi. Welcome, everybody. Let me add my welcome to Sarah. As if we've not met yet, my name's Robbie. I'm the vicar here, and it's great to have you with us. You might want to, if you've closed it already or not yet picked it up, you might want to turn to one of the Pew Bibles. There should be one nearby. We're on page 1002. We'll be looking at that reading from Mark's Gospel. We're kind of walking through these few weeks, Mark's Gospel, quite slowly, bit by bit, just getting a sense of what Jesus is like. And we saw last week that he claims to be the king of a new kingdom. It's a song we sang with the kids and stuff just now. And in this reading, we see lots of his power and authority. And as I speak and say something like that in modern day kind of Britain in 2024, we need to set that in the context of what lots of people think about power and authority. There's an election coming up. I don't know if you've come across the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index. Does anyone know what that is? It's basically a survey that they do about trust in different professions. And we live in what some people have called a crisis of authority and trust. According to the Ipsos Veracity Index, just 9% of the British public say they trust politicians to tell the truth. That's bad, isn't it? It's so low. Last general election, only just over half of young people aged 18 to 24 turned out to vote. The lowest of any age group. And the reason? They don't trust people in power. We've got a serious trust issue when it comes to power, hasn't it? And it's not just politicians. There's a decline in trust in the police. Apparently that's the lowest in 40 years. And sitting just under priests on their kind of index of who are the most and least trusted professions, guess what it is? It's vicars. Now, one of the things behind that, obviously, is that people in power sometimes do really, really awful things. That's part of it. But there's also, I wonder, a bit of a shift in where we place trust and authority. Lots of people point this out, that in the past, you kind of look to the tradition or the institution or the classic authority figures. But as soon as those start letting you down, well, where do you look? You begin to look instead within. So just think of any Disney movie that you may have watched with your grandkids or your kids or something. The main message is exactly that. Look within. Follow your heart. That's Moana. Live your dream. That's Tangled. Listen to your inner voice. That's Toy Story 4. But it's not just kids. The most popular song requested at funerals, do you know what it is? I Did It My Way by Frank Sinatra. No one has the authority to tell me what to do. I'm not following anyone else. I follow myself. And it sounds like a good idea. But what happens when you let yourself down? What if my way doesn't quite work out like I wanted it to? What if my way is the wrong way? Like I said, we're reading through Mark's Gospel, and it's probably one of the most exciting and confrontational pieces of literature ever written. It's a short, punchy, eyewitness account of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And so far, Mark's not hung around telling us the claims that Jesus makes. He's the Christ, the long-promised Messiah from the Old Testament, from the Jewish scriptures. And he's the Son of God. He claims to be God himself come to earth. We've seen his claims, and we saw last week his call as well. Follow me, he says to the disciples. Follow my authority. I want to be number one, the Lord and King over your life. And if you've been reading through, you're thinking at this stage, I reckon, well, fine, that's pretty massive. But what's the proof? Why should I bother? We've been crying out for evidence, I think, if you've been tracking with us. And what we've got in this little section, it kind of starts in verse 14 and goes to verse 34, is just one day in Jesus' life. It's a 24-hour period. And suddenly, the evidence for his power begins to come thick and fast. Remember last week, he walked up to a bunch of fishermen, said just 2 words, and they dropped everything and followed him. Then he comes and heals or drives out an evil spirit. That's what we'll think about this week. And next week, we'll come on to it. With a word, he heals disease. His power over sickness, his power over evil, his power over people. This is Jesus in action. And it's fast-paced, isn't it? It's like a superhero comic. Kapow, bam, zap. He does this and that. Or a film from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We come face to face with his dynamic power, his awesome character, and his incredible authority. And just track through. Let's look at it again. It's dramatic. Verse 21. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. Okay, you can picture the scene. Capernaum's quite a small sort of fishing town. It's probably quite traditional. It's probably quite religious. Everyone's in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And Jesus is giving the sermon. And by all accounts, verse 22, it seems to be going pretty well. And then, verse 23, someone in the congregation suddenly shouts out, and there's this huge altercation. Now, I'm quite new to St. Peter's. I don't know if anything like this has ever happened here in anyone's living memory, someone shouting out. I previously worked in city centre churches, and I can think of 2 or 3 times when there's been some massive altercation because someone's come in who've been particularly distressed or something like that, and it's quite disruptive. Maybe you're the kind of person who thinks, oh man, church is so boring, it would make it more exciting if something like this did happen. But actually, when you look at the details of what happens in verse 24 and how Mark describes it in verse 23, it's kind of scary. Verse 23, he's a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit. And you think, wow, weird. Now, some people want to dismiss this stuff out of hand immediately. Oh, this was before they understood mental health or psychological conditions, and it's just a kind of superstitious misdiagnosis. We don't believe in any of that supernatural stuff anymore. Modern science has changed all that. But if that is your attitude, before you completely write off what's going on here, just remember, Mark's gospel is claiming to be about a God who stands outside of space and time, who created the laws of nature and science. If anything is supernatural, then it's him. That's part of the premise. It is weird. It is unusual, for sure. But so is the idea that the uncreated creator of everything that exists would step into the world as a man. If Jesus is the Son of God, then you're granting the existence of something spiritual, something outside of the reach of what we can understand through modern science. And if he is the Son of God, then you'd expect him to know what he's talking about when it comes to good and evil, right? You might even expect that his coming into the world exposes evil and darkness in a kind of unusual way, in a way that's even more on display. Now, hear me right. It doesn't mean that everything in the world can be explained by some kind of evil spirits or supernaturalism. Christianity has a much more nuanced account of the human person and of human evil. And it doesn't mean that the Bible has no categories for mental health or struggles with things like that. We have to be careful, because there are some Christian communities, I think, who use the language of demon possession or spiritual things or evil spirits in a way that's actually really unhelpful. But the reality is this: Jesus believes in personal forces of evil, something spiritual that is going on in this world. And if that scares you, just notice who is actually most terrified here. Look at verse 24. What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? The evil spirit says. Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. The evil spirit gets it. He knows who Jesus is, and it freaks him out. Have you come to destroy evil? Yup. Yes, I have, says Jesus. And what he says in verse 24 is just so much authority and power, isn't it? Be quiet, said Jesus sternly. Come out of him. And with a word, the evil is banished. Doesn't want to leave, shakes the man violently, comes out of him with a shriek, but it has to, because evil has come face to face with a power and an authority that is stronger and that is good. Just clock what's going on here. This is not sort of yin and yang, some epic eternal battle between the forces of evil and the forces of good that sort of goes on and on and on throughout eternity. This is knockout in the first few seconds of the first round in the ring. Jesus has incredible power. Evil does not stand a chance against his white-hot purity and goodness. Now remember our questions from Mark's Gospel. If you were here a few weeks ago, I said there are basically 3 questions that you can ask all the way through, and they'll help you get a good sense of what Mark's on about. Who is Jesus? Why did he come? And what does it actually mean to follow him? And we're beginning to answer those questions and build a bit of a picture, aren't we, about who Jesus is. I wonder if it's the kind of Jesus that you expect. This isn't gentle Jesus, meek and mild, the sort of soporific, pasty-faced white man you sometimes see in stained glass windows. This guy radiates a calm and assured authority. It's like the completely stacked older brother who comes round to sort out the playground bully. Why has he come? To sort out evil for good. And it's such good news. I don't know about you. Some people don't really think very much about good and evil, those big questions of life. But for others, the evil in our world keeps us up at night. You think, how could a loving God possibly allow such evil to exist, such horrible suffering, either on the news or maybe it's closer to home for you in my own life? But Jesus steps into space, time, and history to bring something good, to do away with evil forever, to bring healing and compassion and restoration. And he's powerful enough to do it. I love that it's both those things. He is absolutely powerful and yet absolutely good at the same time. If it was one, not the other, it would be no comfort to us at all. Power, but no compassion? That is a scary thought. That's the Ipsos veracity index, isn't it? We're right to be distrustful when people in power misuse their authority. But if it's just compassion and no power, then, it's kind of nice. It's like, there, I sympathize, but there's nothing he can do. But Jesus is both. He is absolutely powerful and absolutely good. He is both able and willing to fix this broken and messed up world for good. What do you make of this guy? We thought about his power and authority over evil, but that's actually not all that Mark wants to show us. Here, let me ask you a question. Imagine today, okay, in the middle of this sermon, someone came in right now in significant distress, shouting and screaming and shrieking, and somebody else just said with a word, "Be quiet, be still," and commands an evil spirit, and everyone knows it's an evil spirit, and the person is healed in a very dramatic way. Imagine you then go home and you have someone over for lunch or something like that, or you go to the pub in the afternoon. How many of you would be talking about the sermon? And how many would be talking about that incident that happened? Okay, you definitely remember the incident, wouldn't you? And so what actually happens is surprising. And you've got to look down at this, otherwise you won't believe that it's there. Look at verse 27. The people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching? And with authority?" He even gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him. What they remember is Jesus' teaching. The fact that Mark really wants to show us this is confirmed if you notice the structure of the passage. Let's have the slide up if you can, Steve. It's a bit silly, this, but one of Mark's favorite things to do is to use a kind of literary device that's technically called a chiasm, but it's much easier to remember if you just think of it like a sandwich. So basically, he says one thing, and then he says something else in the middle, and then he says something else at the end. And the kind of two bits of bread of the sandwich, if you like, are related, and then the thing in the middle is something different. And you notice that there's a sandwich design like that in this passage. So have a look down. Verse 21 to 22, there's some repeated words. They're all amazed at the teaching. He teaches with authority. Then you get the miracle, verse 23, 26. And then Mark's kind of repeating some of those same words again, 27 through 28. They're amazed, again, at his teaching, and there's authority. He really wants to emphasize his amazing, authoritative teaching. Before the miracle, the people are amazed because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Verse 22. Now, the teachers of the law are the kind of priests or pastors or vicars or whatever of the time. And you can imagine what would happen. You'd go to the synagogue on a Sabbath, and they'd have opened up the Torah, the Jewish scriptures, and at best, it's a kind of explanation of what's there, an interpretation. At worst, it's very, very boring. There was a kind of tradition of Jesus' time just to cite the different rabbis and their interpretations. So according to Rabbi Ben Sira, our passage today speaks of the eschatological expectation of the Second Temple period, but according to Rabbi Hillel, blah, 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 and it's just boring. But Jesus stands up in the synagogue, and it is electric. You can hear a pin drop. And it's not that Jesus was cleverer or funnier or started with a joke. The difference is about his authority. When he speaks about heaven as if he's actually been there. He speaks about his Father God as if he kind of knows him. He speaks about the human condition as if he sees right through each person and knows our hearts. He doesn't just show us the way some people like to find God. He says, "I am the way." Authority literally means from the essence of something. It's the same kind of idea, it's the same root anyway, as the word that we use for author, like the author of a book. Jesus has the authority to speak into our lives like he came up with them. It's like the writer of a play who writes himself into the script. Or imagine it a bit like this. Imagine that this room, these sort of four walls, are all that you've ever known. You were born here. You spent your entire life inside with all these people. I don't know whether you'd like that or not. With no way out. The doors are locked and there's no way. I mean, you can only dimly see through the windows, can't you? And the conversation gets going. I wonder what it's like outside. Some in the room are skeptical. Oh, there's nothing out there. This is all we've ever known. It's all we've ever seen. How do you know? Some are hopeful. I think it's a really beautiful place. A place of meaning and color and beauty and culture. Some just sort of trust themselves and follow their gut. Others are more agnostic. But how would you ever know? How would you ever know what is outside of these doors? But imagine what happens if there's a knock on the door over there, and it opens up, and someone steps in from the outside. More than that, the architect of the building, the designer. When that happens, it is a game changer. You've got to sit up and listen. You may reject what he says, that's fine, but you can't ignore it. And it's kind of like that with Jesus here. And the impact of his teaching is phenomenal. When people hear, they are changed. They begin to love God and others. They begin to understand themselves and the world. I was reading about the biography of this French guy. He's got a great French name, Émile Caillet. Okay, he grew up in a household that was very scientific, where the Bible was basically viewed as a fairy story, and he never read it. And he fought in one of the world wars, and he was very severely wounded. And as he recovered from this wound, he searched more and more for, in his words, a book that would understand me. So he set about this huge kind of task of lots of reading of the classics, of literature, of philosophy, and he got a journal and he started writing down all the passages from these things that he was reading that would particularly spoke to him. And he says, the day came when I had finally finished my journal, and I sat down and I opened it up and I read through it, and I thought, wow, it's going to really understand me. And it just completely let him down. He says, instead of speaking to my condition, the various passages reminded me of their own context. They just reminded me of me. It carried no strength of persuasion. It didn't work because it was only of my own making. So in a dejected mood, he puts the book away and kind of wonders what to do. But then someone passes him a Bible, and he happens to chance upon Jesus' teaching in Matthew's Gospel, the Beatitudes. And he says, I read, and I read, and I read, and then I read aloud with an indescribable warmth surging. I couldn't find words to express my awe and wonder, and suddenly the realization dawned upon me, this was the book that would understand me. I continued to read, he says, deeply into the night, mostly from the Gospels, those eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life. And lo and behold, he says, as I looked through them, the one of whom they spoke, the one who spoke and acted in them, became alive to me. Jesus still speaks today through his word. And don't you find it compelling? You may or may not call yourself a Christian, I don't know. But don't you find it compelling that 2,000 years later, we still can't shake off Jesus' authoritative teaching? It's the content of everything from primary school assemblies to university PhDs. And it is still changing lives. He still speaks today with amazing authority. And he calls us to follow him. So as we close, the obvious question is, are you listening? What is your relationship like with his word, the Bible? Maybe you've never really read it for yourself as a thinking adult. You've still got that sort of fairy story attitude. Maybe you've grown a bit cold to what Jesus says. You're just out of the habit of hearing. Maybe there are aspects of what Jesus says that kind of great. I prefer to do it my way. As he speaks, Jesus makes huge claims. He is the one with all power and authority. The call to follow him, it's not just an invitation, it's a command. You either take it or leave it. But we've also seen that with his authority comes incredible goodness. He's come into the world to deal with evil and sin and sickness and suffering and hurt and pain and oppression forever. He is someone we can trust to do good. Let me pray. Father, thanks for showing us what Jesus is like, his person and his character and his power and his goodness. And Father, as he speaks to us, help us to be those who listen and hear and obey. In Jesus' name, amen.